I was watching the clock when the door to my office slowly creaked open. He walked in, my husband's nephew, whom I had been expecting. His mother, my husband's sister, had asked me to help him find a job and I couldn't refuse. He was a few years younger than us, tall and confident. His light eyes immediately grabbed attention, and his demeanor carried a kind of natural charm that was hard to ignore. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said, with that slightly mischievous but undeniably attractive smile that seemed impossible to overlook. I smiled back, trying to maintain a professional distance, though his charm was palpable, even in those first few words. He sat across from my desk, easily making himself comfortable, as if this were not an office but a casual place for a friendly chat. "Well, let's get started," I said, gathering my thoughts. "Your mother mentioned you're looking for an internship?" He nodded, his gaze calm and focused. Despite his age, there was a certain maturity about him, an ability to carry himself in any situation. But his confidence also seemed almost playful, as though he enjoyed observing the impression he made on others. "Yes, I want to try my hand at marketing," he began. And immediately I sensed he was serious. There was not a hint of hesitation in his voice. We started discussing the job details. He grasped everything quickly, asking precise questions, and I felt as though I was talking to a colleague rather than a newcomer fresh out of university. He clearly wasn't someone who drifted aimlessly. We talked about tasks, schedules, prospects, and I realized working with him would be easy. Within an hour, he understood most of what I was explaining. He occasionally made jokes, easily lightening the atmosphere, and it felt like there was something more than just a professional exchange. The air was tinged with a light flirtation, though I tried not to take it seriously. It was fleeting, almost innocent, something that wouldn't go beyond this. "I'm really grateful for this opportunity," he said as our meeting came to an end. "I feel like I can learn a lot from you." His words were casual, but his eyes conveyed something else, a curiosity that was hard to decipher. I felt a brief warmth rise inside me but quickly dismissed it. This was just polite conversation, nothing more. "I'm glad you think so. I hope you'll enjoy working with us," I replied, trying to conceal my own emotions. When he left, I paused for a moment, staring out the window, reflecting on what had just happened. On the one hand, it was an ordinary meeting. On the other, something new, though barely noticeable, was already lingering in the air. Something I wasn't ready to admit just yet. Time at work flew by quickly. Every new day with my husband's nephew seemed more interesting than the last. His enthusiasm was contagious. He came up with new ideas, made unexpected suggestions, and showed so much creativity that sometimes I felt like he had been working at our company for years. He adapted to his responsibilities swiftly, as if he had absorbed everything from the very first day. But there was something else I couldn't help but notice. Every time we discussed projects, he looked at me not just as his superior, but with something more in his eyes. It was subtle, but I caught his glances, filled with genuine interest and perhaps even admiration. One day, as I passed by his desk, he glanced up from his computer and smiled at me. "You look great today," he said, squinting slightly as if sharing a secret. It was said casually, almost offhand, but it still made me feel warm inside. I smiled back, trying not to give much importance to his words. It was just politeness, or maybe a way to keep the mood light at work. But something inside me stirred. There was nothing overt in his compliments, yet I felt like he was playing a game, and oddly enough, I liked being part of it, even if I wasn't taking it too seriously for now. "Thank you," I replied, continuing on with my tasks. But his compliments didn't stop. They became part of our daily interactions. Sometimes it was a light joke, sometimes something more personal. He always seemed to find the right words at the right time. Occasionally, I wondered how far he was willing to take this game, and where exactly the line was, the one neither he nor I wanted to cross. Our conversations gradually shifted into more personal territory. He told me about his hobbies, about how he wanted to grow in his career. To my own surprise, I started sharing some of my thoughts and feelings with him, things I didn't even talk about with my husband. It was easy with him. He always knew how to keep the conversation going, and his humor smoothed over any rough edges. But there was still that professional distance between us, which I thought would protect us from any suggestion of something more. One day, while we were discussing another project, he made another joke and I couldn't help but laugh. "Do you always work this seriously?" he teased, winking at me. "Sometimes it's useful," I replied, feeling a smile spread across my lips again. "But you're right, sometimes you need to relax." I began to notice how his attention toward me was slowly becoming more than just professional interest. His glances lingered on me longer than they should have, and his compliments became more personal, though always within the bounds of propriety. It was innocent, a game that I found engaging. I still saw it as nothing more than light flirtation, and despite that, I started enjoying his attention. But I didn't let myself go beyond those boundaries. I was sure everything was under control. A few more weeks passed, and our conversations became more informal. One evening, when he stayed late in the office, I stayed with him, and once again our discussions turned personal. He told me about his family, his childhood, his plans for the future, and I found myself genuinely interested in what he had to say. I began to realize that our mutual affection was growing, but I still didn't give it much thought. It all felt too easy and carefree. And although deep down I knew he was attracting me, I tried to push those thoughts away. After all, this was just a game, an innocent, harmless game. Our work continued as usual, but my interactions with my husband's nephew had long ceased to be strictly professional. We often had lunch together, stepping outside the office to change the scenery, to take a break. It all began with innocent invitations. "Let's grab lunch together," he would say, and I would agree. These lunches became our little tradition, something I quietly looked forward to as they brought a lightness I hadn't realized I had been missing. Time spent with him felt refreshing, different. Today, we found ourselves at a cozy cafe near the office once again. Time seemed to slow down as we spoke, and our conversation drifted further from work and closer to personal matters, life, dreams, and plans. We always found something in common to discuss, and being with him gave me a sense of ease, something rare. With him, I could let my guard down, relax, and just be myself, far removed from the professional masks I wore at work. "You know," he said, leaning forward slightly across the table, his gaze settling on mine, "you're nothing like the strict boss I imagined you'd be." I couldn't help but laugh at his remark, though I knew there was more to his words than just humor. I liked the way he saw me, not just as his superior, but as someone more than that. His gaze lingered, trailing down to my lips for a fleeting moment, and I felt an unexpected tension rise between us. I pushed the thought away, but the air felt different, heavier. "You haven't gotten to know me fully yet," I teased back, smiling in return. He paused, as if thinking something over, his eyes holding mine. Then, in an instant, before I could react, he stood up slightly from his chair, leaned in closer, and pulled me to him, his arm wrapping firmly around my waist. I gasped, caught completely off guard as his hand gripped my side, his strong fingers pressing me tightly against him. His lips brushed my cheek, playful, light, but the embrace was not. It was firm, intimate, and powerful. For a moment I froze, a rush of sensations overwhelming me. His hold was firm but not forceful, and the warmth of his body felt almost shocking. A mix of embarrassment, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name surged through me. My mind raced, trying to process the situation, and for a second I felt breathless, not sure how to respond. I laughed, quickly trying to brush off the moment, forcing myself to act as though nothing had happened. It was just playful, I told myself. Yet, his hand stayed on my waist for a second too long before he finally released me, a satisfied smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're full of surprises," I managed to say, still trying to catch my breath and regain my composure. "Couldn't resist," he said smoothly, his eyes still watching me as if waiting to see how I would react. I tried to play it off as nothing, but the intensity of his embrace left me feeling shaken in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just a simple, playful kiss on the cheek. The way he held me, the closeness, it made me question everything that had been happening between us. What I had thought was harmless flirting now felt like something more dangerous, something I might not be able to control. We finished our lunch, but the atmosphere between us had shifted. While we continued to talk, my thoughts kept returning to the moment he had held me so closely. that tight grip around my waist, the warmth of his body pressing against mine. It left me feeling both flustered and oddly drawn in. I couldn't shake the feeling that the boundaries between us were blurring, slipping away faster than I had anticipated. On the way back to the office, I kept replaying the scene in my mind. I told myself it was just harmless, that nothing had changed, but deep down, I knew something had. What once seemed like a lighthearted distraction, a game of flirtation, was quickly turning into something more. I was starting to see that he had a growing effect on me, something I hadn't prepared for. When we returned to the office, I noticed his eyes still lingering on me, his smile lingering just as long. It amused me, it intrigued me, but it also made me wary. I told myself I could keep this under control, that it was just a way to escape the dullness of my routine life. But as the day went on, I found myself wondering whether I truly could control this situation. His presence was becoming a temptation I wasn't sure I was ready to face. This wasn't just a game anymore. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. But part of me couldn't deny that I was already being drawn into it, deeper than I had ever intended. The office buzzed as usual, phone calls, the soft clatter of keyboards, the familiar hum of a busy workday. I was sitting at my desk, scrolling through emails when one caught my eye. It was a proposal to organize a major event in another city. For a moment I paused, thinking about who I could bring along to help me. I skimmed through the list of potential candidates, but my thoughts unexpectedly drifted back to that moment in the cafe, when he had held me by the waist, his kiss leaving an odd aftertaste I couldn't shake. Deep down, something told me this might not be the best idea, but I pushed that thought aside. It was just a trip, just work, no strings attached, no consequences. I decided to offer him the trip. He was proactive, smart, and besides, a trip to another city could be a bit of light fun, a break from the usual routine. It could be a one-time thing, left behind on the train, never extending beyond that moment. No emotions, no promises. I could relax, enjoy the moment, and return to normal when we got back. I called him into my office, feeling a slight twinge of excitement, but doing my best to hide it. He entered, as confident as always, with that playful smile that always left me feeling a little off balance. "I've been asked to organize an event in another city," I began, looking at him. "And I thought you might want to help." His eyes lit up, and I could tell he caught the underlying meaning, though we both pretended it was just a professional offer. "Of course," he said, stepping a little closer. "When do we leave?" Something stilled inside me. I had convinced myself that everything was under control. We would simply spend a few days away from work and it would stay there, contained. It was supposed to be a chance to escape, something new, but without any consequences. I had no idea how wrong I was. The train swayed gently as it carried us farther from the city. The window outside was cloaked in darkness, and the quiet of the compartment only heightened the sense of isolation. We sat across from each other, alone in this small, confined space, cut off from the world. I tried to maintain a distance, but his gaze lingered on me, persistent and difficult to escape. We started with the usual topics, upcoming events, work details, but soon the conversation drifted into more personal territory. With each passing minute, the tension between us grew, thickening the air in the small compartment. I knew it was inevitable. "I need to tell you something." His voice broke the silence, soft yet firm. I looked at him, meeting his serious gaze. There was something new in his eyes, something deeper than the usual playful banter. He leaned in slightly, as if what he was about to say was meant for my ears alone. "I've always liked you," he whispered, the words brushing against me like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. For a moment I froze. The atmosphere shifted instantly, becoming denser, more charged. It was something I couldn't simply ignore. Inside me, anxiety flared, but so did a strange anticipation. "I need to change," I said abruptly, standing up to avoid his gaze. I turned toward the luggage shelf, trying to focus on the task at hand. The compartment was small, and I didn't want to step out into the corridor, so I began undressing right there. I removed my jacket, feeling his eyes on my back, tracing every movement. His gaze was almost tangible, each second stretching out, making the space between us feel smaller. As I reached to pull my shirt off my shoulders, tension thickened unbearably. I turned around sharply, intending to say something, but I didn't get the chance. He stood up, and before I knew what was happening, his hands were on my waist. But he didn't stop there. In one swift motion, he pulled me onto his lap, seating me firmly on his knees. I froze, sitting on his lap, feeling his hot breath against my face. One of his hands gripped my waist tightly while the other rested on my hips, holding me in place. It all happened so fast I couldn't even protest. Our eyes locked, and in that moment everything changed. I couldn't fight this. His confidence, his strength, and the passion I could feel radiating from him. My lips moved toward his on their own, and in the next instant we were kissing. The kiss was hungry, intense, filled with all the tension that had built up between us over the past few weeks. He held me tightly, pulling me closer, leaving no space for hesitation or retreat. His hands roamed over my hips, and I felt my body tremble in response to his touch. I couldn't resist any longer. We both knew this was the moment when everything fell apart. All the rules, the boundaries we had set were left behind. Our bodies moved together, and I fully gave in to his desire, forgetting everything else. We spent the night together in that confined compartment, surrounded by the darkness and the quiet hum of the train, as if the world outside no longer existed. For me, it was a moment of weakness. I wanted to believe it would stay here, in the train, in this night. But I saw something different in his eyes, something that meant so much more to him, and that thought filled me with dread. The event started early in the morning. The hall buzzed with voices, the rustling of programs, and the soft padding of footsteps on the carpet. I was supposed to focus on organizing, making sure everything ran smoothly, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that night on the train. His hands, his breath, the warmth of his body, it all seemed to linger on my skin, refusing to fade. I tried to convince myself that it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness left behind in the darkness of the train, but reality was much more complicated. I felt his gaze on me before I even dared to meet his eyes. He hadn't stopped watching me since we walked into the venue. His attention was so persistent, so overt, that it was nearly impossible for me to concentrate on what was happening around us. Every time I turned my head, he was looking at me, steadily, unapologetically. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it would pass. But with each passing minute, his insistence became more obvious. He moved closer, found excuses to be near me. Every time he spoke to me, there were hints in his voice that left no doubt about his intentions. "We need to finish what we started," he whispered in my ear when we found ourselves in a quiet corner of the hall. I recoiled, feeling my cheeks flush with heat. This wasn't just harmless flirtation. He took us seriously. For me, it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness I didn't plan to repeat. But for him, it seemed to mean something entirely different. "We need to focus on the event," I responded, trying to steer the conversation back to professionalism. I was certain I could handle this. I had to. But his persistence worried me more and more. He didn't seem to understand. Or perhaps he didn't want to understand. That for me it had been nothing more than a fleeting moment of weakness, something I wanted to forget. To him, it had become something much more significant. He wasn't backing off. In fact, his demands were becoming increasingly clear. I tried to keep my distance, to deflect his advances, but he wasn't giving me any room to escape. His insistence unnerved me. He sought my gaze, tried to catch my attention every time I came into his view. Even in a crowd, I could feel his proximity, his piercing gaze, and it made me feel deeply uncomfortable. At one point, I realized that he wanted more. His behavior was becoming more invasive, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. He didn't just want a continuation. He expected something bigger, something I couldn't and didn't want to give him. "You know it wasn't just that." His voice came from behind me again when we were alone in one of the staff rooms. I turned around, feeling the tension mount. I could see that for him this was far too important. But for me, it had been just a moment, a mistake, a weakness. I took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. "It was a mistake," I said softly but firmly. "It doesn't mean what you think it does." His expression changed. For a moment, I saw disappointment flash across his face, but then his eyes hardened, becoming cold and determined. "We both know that's not true," he said, stepping closer. A wave of anxiety surged through me. This had gone too far. I thought I could leave it in the past, that the trip had been just a coincidence. But he saw it differently, and his persistence was starting to scare me. We were returning home after the trip. The train swayed gently, just like it had on that first night. My husband's nephew sat across from me, and I could feel him trying to rekindle the spark that had flared between us. His gaze, persistent and full of desire, made his intentions clear. But I was different now. After that night on the train, everything had changed within me. I realized it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that should never happen again. He tried to approach me, took steps to reignite what we had started, but I remained distant, cold. No more flirtation, no more suggestive glances. I avoided his touches, pulling away whenever he tried to get close. His attempts to recreate that night fell flat against my indifference. "What's wrong with you?" he finally asked, irritation clear in his voice. "You can't just forget everything that happened." I remained silent. Inside, I was conflicted, but I refused to show it. It had been just once, a single moment I wanted to erase as if it had never happened. I couldn't allow it to ruin my life, my marriage, even though guilt gnawed at me. When we returned to the city, I did everything I could to distance myself from him. At the office, I only interacted with him professionally, avoiding any personal conversations, but I knew he wasn't going to give up that easily. Today, he entered my office without knocking, his face serious, his gaze cold. The light flirtation was gone. Something had shifted. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. I felt my stomach tighten. I knew this conversation was inevitable, but I wasn't ready for it. He stepped closer, and I saw something new in his eyes, not just desire, but demand. "You can't just pretend like nothing happened," he started, his voice firm. "You think you can act like it didn't matter? You can't ignore me." I stood up, trying to keep my composure, though inside I was trembling. "It was a mistake," I said as confidently as I could. "I'm not going to continue this." His eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "A mistake? That's what it was for you?" He stepped closer and I took a step back. "You think you can just forget it? I'm not backing down. You can't act like this never happened." "I'm not going to ruin my life over this," I said, my voice beginning to waver. It was a moment of weakness, and I don't want it to happen again. But he wasn't listening. His gaze grew colder, and his words took on a dangerous edge. "If you don't want to do this again," he said, stepping even closer, "then I'll tell my uncle everything. You think he'll be happy to find out his wife cheated on him with his nephew?" His words struck me like a blow. I felt the ground fall out from under me. He was threatening to destroy my marriage, my life. Everything I had tried so hard to protect was now hanging by a thread. I was stunned. Panic gripped me, but I tried to stay calm. "You can't do that," I whispered, feeling a cold shiver run through me. "I can. And I will if you don't start doing what I want." His voice was low and menacing. I realized that the situation had spiraled out of control. He was demanding something from me that I couldn't give. I was faced with an impossible choice: give in to his demands and play his game, or risk everything: my marriage, my reputation. My heart raced. I was standing on the edge, not knowing how to escape. But one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore this any longer. Night had settled over the house, but there was no peace in my mind. Every thought kept returning to his threats, to his words, which now felt like a verdict. I was trying to figure out how to get out of this situation, but all I could find was panic and fear. Everything I had built with my husband seemed on the verge of falling apart. I knew I couldn't give in to his demands. Even if he exposed everything, I couldn't let him control my life. My marriage was already unraveling. We had grown distant, and I no longer saw any point in hiding the truth. My mistake was like poison, slowly destroying both of us. But I didn't anticipate that he would go to his mother for advice. Desperate, unsure of what to do next, the nephew confided in her. He wanted to understand how to proceed, but instead of giving him support or guidance, she exploded. She couldn't believe her son was involved in something like this, and her only reaction was to confront me immediately. She wasn't going to wait. That evening, the phone rang. I picked it up and heard her voice, filled with anger and shock. "Is it true?" she started, her voice trembling, skipping any greetings. "Did you really do this with my son in the train compartment?" Her words hit me like a punch. My heart stopped, and my body tensed as if bracing for a blow. I couldn't believe he had told her. Everything I had feared was now becoming reality. My hands shook, and I could barely manage to say anything in response. "Is it true?" she repeated, this time more insistent, her voice filled with pain and disappointment. I froze, unsure of what to say. The secret I had tried so hard to keep was about to be revealed, and now everything depended on how I answered that question. My silence only added fuel to the fire, and I could feel the situation spiraling further out of control. I knew this day would come, but I never thought it would be this soon. Since that phone call, I hadn't been able to find peace. My husband's sister knew, and now everything was hanging by a thread. I knew there was no avoiding the confrontation, but I had hoped, deep down, that she would take time to think things through, to come to a more rational decision. How wrong I was. A sudden knock on the door startled me. There she was, standing at the threshold, my husband's sister, her face contorted with anger and disappointment. Her eyes blazed with fury, and I realized there was no room for compromise. "We need to talk," her voice was full of steely resolve. Her fists clenched by her sides, and I knew this wouldn't be just a conversation. "My husband is sleeping," I began, trying to soften my tone, knowing that raising our voices might wake him. "Let's talk quietly. There's no need to wake him." "Do you dare tell me how to behave?" she growled, unable to contain her fury. "You've crossed every line. My brother needs to know the truth." I felt the floor drop out from under me. She was going to tell him, right now, without delay. I raised my hands, trying to signal for calm, desperate to buy myself some time. "Please, let's talk," I said, clinging to any shred of hope. "It's a complicated situation, and I understand that you're angry, but we can work something out." "Work something out?" She cut me off, her eyes flaring with fresh rage. "Work something out? You betrayed him, my brother? And you think this can be worked out? You broke his trust. How could you? With his nephew, of all people." I knew my words wouldn't calm her down. I was at a loss, but I tried to explain anyway, knowing it was probably futile. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness," I mumbled, but she wasn't listening. "A mistake? You call this a mistake?" Her voice was growing louder, and I realized with horror that if she kept shouting, my husband would wake up soon. "No, he has to know, and he's going to know now." She spun around and headed for the bedroom where my husband was peacefully sleeping, completely unaware that his world was about to come crashing down. "No, please don't," I cried, trying to stop her, but she was already stepping toward the bedroom door. Her resolve was unshakable. "Enough of this hiding. You've crossed the line and he deserves to know the truth," she said, flinging open the door and stepping inside. I stood frozen in the hallway, feeling the world collapse around me. I knew this was the end. No more excuses could save me now. My husband was about to learn everything, and there was no escaping the consequences. My heart pounded wildly in my chest as I realized the moment of reckoning had come. I sat in the hallway, barely breathing, as my husband's sister walked into the bedroom. My heart pounded so loudly that it echoed in my ears. Each second dragged on unbearably, and I wished I could freeze time, stop the inevitable from happening, but deep down, I knew it was too late. From behind the door, I heard their voices. At first, it was the muffled voice of my husband's sister, then the confusion in my husband's voice. He had just woken up, and it seemed he hadn't yet grasped what was happening. His voice was full of bewilderment. "What? What are you talking about?" he asked, still groggy, sounding as if he were trapped in a dream. I pressed myself against the wall, terrified of hearing the inevitable. His sister wasn't holding back. Her voice was trembling with anger and emotion. "Your wife!" she shouted. "She cheated on you with your nephew in the train compartment when they went to the event." For a moment, there was silence, as if the air itself had frozen in the room. Then I heard my husband's voice filled with disbelief and horror. "Am I still dreaming?" His voice was quiet, but the rage was starting to build. "How can this be true?" He got out of bed, and I heard his heavy, determined footsteps. each one bringing him closer to full realization. Moments later, he stepped out of the bedroom, his gaze locked on me. In his eyes, I saw a mix of shock, fury, and pain. Is it true?" He stopped in front of me, his voice shaking, but the anger was becoming more evident. I tried to find the words, but they stuck in my throat. All I could manage was a mumble, but he cut me off. "Speak, is it true?" he shouted, his voice rising with each word. I looked at him and everything inside me collapsed. It felt like the world was crumbling around us. His face was twisted with pain, with the impossibility of believing that I could have done such a thing. In his eyes, I saw the trust we had built over the years dissolve into nothing. "It was a mistake," I began, my words feeling hollow, unable to convey the depth of my regret. "A mistake?" he spat, his voice filled with hurt and contempt. "You call this a mistake? You cheated on me with my nephew. How could you? What is happening?" I knew there was no point in trying to defend myself. My words sounded like pitiful attempts to fix something that was beyond repair. I just stood there, staring at the man I had betrayed, realizing that our marriage was already a thing of the past. Yes, it's true," I finally said, feeling the weight of those words shatter whatever was left between us. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness, but I know it doesn't change anything." My husband froze as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was as if he thought he was still dreaming, caught in a nightmare. But the reality was too painful. He couldn't hide his rage and disgust. "I can't be with you anymore," he said, his voice cold and final. "I'm filing for divorce." Those words felt like a sentence. Everything I had tried so hard to protect crumbled in an instant. I knew our marriage was beyond saving. And now, there was nothing left but emptiness. After everything that happened, I packed my things and temporarily moved in with a friend. I couldn't stay in our house anymore, where every corner reminded me of what I had destroyed. My friend offered her support, and I accepted, knowing I needed time to collect my thoughts. My husband and I agreed to meet later, once the emotions had cooled down, to calmly discuss what would happen next. Today was that day. We arranged to meet in the park, a neutral place, far from all the memories that only added to the pain. He arrived first, standing on the path, waiting, looking into the distance. I walked toward him, my heart tightening at the thought that this conversation might be our last chance to salvage whatever remained of civility between us. He noticed me but made no gesture to greet me. His face remained cold, and I knew this wasn't going to be easy. We started walking slowly along the path, neither of us saying a word, until he finally stopped and, without turning to face me, coldly said, "What do you want to say?" He was willing to listen, but I could see in his eyes that the decision had already been made. Still, I knew I had to try to explain myself, even though I realized it probably wouldn't change anything. "It was a mistake," I began, choosing my words carefully, though I knew no words could soften the pain I had caused him. "It was a moment of weakness. Our relationship had grown cold. I felt like we were losing our connection, that our conversations had become empty, that we were living like neighbors, not like a couple." He stood there, his fists clenched, his face cold, but I could see that my words were reaching him, even just slightly. "And you thought the best solution was to do this dirty things with my nephew?" His voice was sharp, as if each word was forged from steel. I flinched at his harshness but continued, knowing I had to say everything no matter how painful it would be. "It was only once. I didn't plan to continue anything. It was a mistake. A weakness. I wanted to forget it, but he started blackmailing me, threatening to tell you everything. I was trapped." He turned to face me, his eyes blazing with anger and hurt. "You chose the easy way out," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Instead of talking to me, instead of trying to solve our problems, you decided to destroy everything. You betrayed me, and now you want me to feel sorry for you because you were being blackmailed? That's no excuse." I tried to step forward, but he moved back, creating even more distance between us. "I know," I said, fully realizing the depth of my mistake. "But it was only once. I didn't want to destroy our marriage. I was weak. Your nephew took advantage of that. I was just trying to escape the monotony, the routine our life had turned into." His eyes narrowed and he shook his head. We all make mistakes, he said slowly, as if weighing each word. But your mistake is costing us our marriage. I can't be with you anymore. You made your choice. My nephew will face consequences too, but first I need to deal with you, so I never have to return to this again. My heart clenched at his words. I knew his decision was final, that he wouldn't back down. I'm filing for divorce, he said firmly, and there was no doubt in his voice. I tried to find the words, but they stuck in my throat. At that moment, I realized I couldn't fight anymore. Our marriage, our past, everything was destroyed, and now there was nothing left but emptiness. It was chilly outside. The wind swept through the park paths, as if emphasizing the cold that now lingered not only outside, but also within me. We finished our conversation and silently walked toward the car parked nearby. Not a single word was spoken. Words no longer had meaning. Everything that could be said had already been said. My husband opened the car door and I followed him, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on my shoulders. We got inside, and silence enveloped us. The only sounds breaking the quiet were the faint hum of the wind outside and the distant noise of cars on the street. "How are we going to divide the assets?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice was cold, emotionless, as if we were discussing some formal, meaningless matter. But I knew that beneath that coldness was something much deeper. Pain, disappointment, loss. "You can keep the house," I said quietly, staring down at my hands. "I don't need anything but my personal belongings." He scoffed, but didn't argue. Maybe he expected me to put up more of a fight, but I didn't have the strength for that. I knew that everything that had once been ours no longer belonged to us. Everything we had was gone in an instant, and now we were just sorting through the debris. "I'll take the car in the garage," he continued, still not looking at me. "And of course, we'll be handling the divorce through lawyers. I don't want to discuss this directly anymore." His words cut through me like knives, but I stayed silent. I knew it was inevitable. I had brought us to this point. "I can't forgive you," he suddenly said, turning toward me. His voice was low, but there was a deep hurt in it. "Everything we had, you destroyed in a single moment. I can't forget that. You've destroyed our marriage." Those words felt like the final verdict. I knew he was right. Everything we had between us was beyond repair, and even if I wanted to fix it, it would be impossible now. "I know," I whispered, looking out the window, trying not to meet his gaze. "And I regret it, but it doesn't change anything anymore." He didn't respond. He just stared out the window, lost in his own thoughts. We were so physically close, but there was a chasm between us that could never be crossed. "There's nothing left to say," he finally said, his words sounding like the final note. "Our paths have diverged, and this is the end." I nodded, unable to say anything. It was over. Our lives, like our possessions, were being divided, and this was final. We were no longer the couple we once were. He opened the car door and stepped out into the cold air. I sat there for a moment longer, trying to come to terms with the fact that this was truly the end. That everything we had was gone. I had destroyed it with my own hands, and now all that remained was cold silence and goodbye. I was still staying at my friend's house. Her home felt like a temporary refuge, but it brought me no comfort. The silence here was different. Not the familiar kind, but foreign, as if everything around me screamed that I didn't belong. My friend tried to support me, but I still felt alone, locked inside my own thoughts. A few days had passed since my last meeting with my husband, and everything inside me had become clear. It was the end of our marriage, the end of the life I once knew. We were no longer together, and it was all my doing. I often sat by the window watching people pass by, continuing their lives as if nothing had changed. Their worries were far from mine. I had no one but my friend who had taken me in, and a few personal belongings I had taken from home. Inside, there was only emptiness. I felt like I had betrayed not just my husband, but myself. The phone rang again. It was him, my husband's nephew. He hadn't stopped trying to reach me. Several times I saw his messages, his calls, but each time I ignored them. I couldn't, and didn't want to talk to him anymore. It had all been a mistake a mistake that had destroyed not only my life but his as well. He was trying to continue what we had, but I knew that was impossible. I sighed and put the phone aside. I couldn't let myself go back to the thing that had destroyed everything. The nephew kept trying to contact me, but I didn't respond to his messages. There was too much pain in the past, and I couldn't allow myself to drown in it again. He needed to understand that it was over, that I wasn't going to keep any ties with him. A decision was forming within me. I had to cut all ties with the past. It was the only way to start over. I couldn't remain a prisoner of my mistakes, couldn't live with that weight anymore. My life had changed, and I could no longer hold on to what had broken me. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but there was no other way. I had to start fresh, let go of the past, and embrace a new future. No apologies or attempts to fix things could bring back what I had lost. Now I had only one option: to leave it all behind and begin anew. The park was empty, with only the sound of leaves rustling in the wind breaking the silence. I walked down the familiar path, trying to find balance between the past and the future. Each step on the gravel echoed through my thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about how my life had fallen apart, how I had let my mistakes destroy everything. But now, in this quiet moment, something had changed. The past no longer haunted me as strongly as it once did. It was still with me, but it felt more distant, like an old wound that had started to heal. Now I knew that I couldn't remain a prisoner of my guilt any longer. I had to make a decision: to stay trapped in the past or to move forward and start fresh. I stopped near the old bench where I used to sit when life was simpler and took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. It was sharp, cold, but somehow cleansing. Thoughts began to form in my mind that life could offer something new if I could just let go of what had been. The past couldn't be changed. I had destroyed my marriage, destroyed the trust, but that didn't mean that my whole life had to remain in ruins. I realized that even though this path had been difficult, it wasn't the end. I still had a chance to find myself again, to start from scratch. I could change my life. Maybe travel, find a new job, something that would help me break free from this cycle of isolation and rediscover who I really was. I knew that I had to let go of what had been. It didn't mean forgetting everything, but I had to learn not to carry the weight of my mistakes into the future. There was still time for change, for growth. I was no longer the person I once was. I had already changed. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind. Now I needed to take that final step. I had made up my mind. I would leave. Maybe not for long, but it would be enough to reset. Deep inside, I knew it was the right decision. I couldn't stay stuck, clinging to the ghosts of the past. I had to move on. My marriage was destroyed, but that didn't mean my life was over. Now that I had freed myself from the chains of the past, I realized that I had a chance to find new happiness. Happiness free from mistakes, free from the oppressive weight of guilt. This new path was not just a journey to find myself, but also an opportunity to build a new life, with new goals and hopes.